your host, and with me I have a guest today, Mr. Marshall.
Hey, what's going on, man?
Not much, man. How you doing?
I'm all right. Living the good life.
That's good. That's good. So, we're going to be talking about the Cherokee today.
Ooh, a little bit of history, I see.
Indeed.
Anything in particular?
Oh, specifically, we're going to be talking about the Cherokee and their adaptation to the white man.
Ooh,
Yeah.
okay. So, like slaves, plantations,
Yeah,
Oh.
indeed.
all right.
Right. Do you happen to know when the Cherokee first actually encountered Europeans?
Well, in the little tad bit of research I did before, we started this little project of yours, first encounter was with a Spanish conquistador. You know who that was?
Oh, which conquistador?
Hernando de Soto.
Oh, really?
It was also their first exposure to African slaves themselves.
Interesting. Wasn't this Hernando de Soto's quest for the seven cities of gold?
Yeah, I believe he landed in Florida, and then he started, going through present-day Georgia, South Carolina. I think a lot of his motivations stemmed from, I think it was in 1521 when Cortez overthrew the Aztecs, and you had all these rumors of Aztec gold and cities of gold.
And he landed in Florida in 1539 and then made his way up to South Carolina.
Yeah.
What would become South Carolina in 1540, yeah?
Yeah. Based off of my understanding.
Fair enough. Though it was quite a while afterwards that they actually had constant contact with Europeans, wasn't it?
Yeah, based off the research I've seen, it was 1690s where they established regular contact with European people, particularly British settlers. Most of that was due in part to superior goods by the British, but also within the direct region that they're in, the British are the closest that threaten their
territorial integrity.
That's a way of putting it.
It's like, as we can see from perspective of history, that's just a fact. Yeah. So they predominantly traded with the Europeans. I'm assuming through the fur trade specifically.
Yeah, fur trade was the biggest right there towards the beginning. But however, unfortunately, Cherokee experienced numerous hardships in the early years.
Undoubtedly.
Two of which were actually attempts by European settlers to enslave them.
Yeah, I heard about that. And it was like, wasn't it the Catawbas, the Savannahs, and the Congarese tribes that were trying to sell Cherokee slaves to the settlers?
Yeah, unfortunately, with disease coming in brought over by Europeans at the time.
It wreaked havoc on all the Native Americans.
It was hard for them to enslave them,
especially when they're in their own homeland too, so they could easily run away.
So honestly, one could make, I've heard the argument made where native indigenous people dying from disease and being able to run away, knowing the land, was one of the major factors that led to African slave trade and bringing Africans over.
It makes sense, especially considering that they wouldn't know the lay of the land and they could, wouldn't be as likely to escape.
Yeah, and having already had centuries of prior contact with Africa, Europe, China.
With the trade. Yep.
With the trade. But
especially with the Portuguese along the west coast of Africa.
Yeah, and drastically, the Cherokee population dropped about half. From disease.
It was 20,000.
To 10,000.
Ooh, yeah. That's
20,000 to 10,000.
That's bad. With as bad as the loss of life was, they also lost considerably large amounts of land before 1776. Wasn't it that they lost near somewhat 50,000 square miles of land?
This is kind of, prior Revolutionary War, but if I remember correctly, the Crown had enacted several treaties with native tribes to where
Indeed.
You couldn't go past a certain...
Where the settlers couldn't go past a certain... was it Appalachia? It was like... that was the cutoff?
Yeah, and, and this is kind of going into, with the American Revolution, George Washington and numerous others who had been promised, what would you call them, like land grants or something, due to French Indian War. They were promised land, but wasn't able to lay claim to it
because of prior treaties made by the British.
Yeah. So, but then, interesting enough, right when you get into the American Revolution, the Cherokee supported the British.
Well, obviously, it made more sense because the British were the ones they had the treaties with, and if the British kept their dominion over the colonials, then it was likely that they might not lose all their territory.
Yeah.
If I remember right, the War of Independence actually ended quite badly for them. They lost, what, near another 8,000 square miles of land?
Yep. Yeah, it was about 8,000 square miles of territory that they had to or cede over to
The newly stated
United States of America. Due to their support of the British, and we know how that played out.
Yes.
So here we are, pre-Revolutionary War. The Cherokee have established contact, fur trade, all these things going on, and then with the Revolutionary War, and even before it, all these treaties, they're losing their land, they're dying from disease. Now, following after the Revolutionary War, their cultural identity is basically diminished, if almost
Very
non-existent.
True. Very true.
So, how do they go about attempting to revitalize themselves? Like, how do you restructure your destroyed society? Basically, it's what were methods they were utilizing?
There were several methods that happened concurrently. One single one being that the early presidents of the Union wanted to actually incorporate the Native Americans into the new Union.
Like political system?
Yeah. They wanted to Christianize them. They wanted to turn them into farmers, and they wanted to convince them to become, equal parts in this new country that they were building.
Yeah, because it's not just the Cherokee attempting to rebuild themselves. I mean, like you said, it's a newly formed government, the United States of America. Mm-hmm. So it's like they're both attempting to discover who they are, their political systems, their government.
Yes. In fact, the federal government actually instituted some programs to actually help the Cherokee start developing into farmers. They gave them plowshares, they gave oxen, they gave seed, they gave other grains and other stipulants. Actually, one of the most interesting things is they gave looms and cotton seeds to the Cherokee women who were starting to grow cotton and weave their own clothes.
Mm-hmm. Now, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this was probably quite a shock to their culture and identity. I mean,
it was indeed.
Yeah.
It explicitly it was, and it's like the primary provider changed from the man to the woman. It's like they even had a
they were
they even had a cultural story about it, about how one of the hunters in the Cherokee went out hunting. He came home, and his wife had weaved so much cloth in the time that he was gone that she had successfully provided for their family in 1 week what he would have provided in 6 months. So he stopped hunting and started to try to learn to become a farmer.
So basically, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, they're seeing the success that I guess you could say white elites are having with the systems they're implementing
with cotton.
So they attempt to mimic it.
Yes, they did try to mimic it, and they did successfully well. In fact, it was their success that made their antagonists, such as Andrew Jackson, so jealous of their success. Specifically, the fact that they were developing new frontier towns where their old villages had been, and they were successfully becoming what the agrarian ideal that Jefferson put down.
Yeah.
And it's like, you developed your land, you promoted your society, and you tried to act in the benefit of the greater whole.
Well, and another interesting thing to point out is they actually started to implement what you could call like slave laws.
Yeah, they did own slaves, actually. Yeah. Approximately 10% of Cherokees owned slaves. I mean, that's less than half of how many whites own slaves, considering that the approximate number of slave owning whites was
25%. Yeah, it was like 25%,
25%.
I think. Because, I mean, you know, when it comes to owning slaves, it's a very elite.
Yeah, it's very cost heavy.
Yeah.
In order to purchase a slave,
And
it was not a poor man's game.
yeah, and in mimicking several laws implemented within the South when it comes to like runaway slaves or those harboring slaves or attempting to assist them, Cherokee slave owners were implementing laws in their courts to where they would punish runaway slaves.
Very much.
Because it's the central
They had to,
economic foundation that
Yes.
they see
There's
success
a
in.
strong economic foundation for the elite society within the Cherokee class, just as it was within the plantation
Yeah,
classes of the Old South.
yeah. And I guess we could just let the evidence speak for itself. You know, I'm sure there's an example of a notable Cherokee member, chief or such that owned slaves or had a plantation.
Yes, actually, in fact, there was a notable Cherokee chief named James Van, owned a considerable portion of slaves. He was, at the time of his death, he was considered not just one of the richest Cherokee, but one of the richest men in the totality of the eastern coast of America. In fact, 2 decades after his death, when the Trail of Tears happened and the forcible removal to Oklahoma, approximately 2,000 slaves marched alongside the Cherokee when they were being relocated.
I mean, that would just make sense to me, just considering they, following the Revolutionary War, they've established a mimic of some sorts of the white elites, the slave owners in the South.
Yeah.
And then after, a couple decades of successful plantation owning and slave owning, then next thing you know, the government comes in and wipes it away. So, I mean, yeah, it would be expected that their slaves would be marching alongside them.
Yeah.
Because they would want to keep that economical foundation.
True. This is also one of the prime reasons why the Cherokee sided with the Confederacy during the Civil
Really?
War. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
It's like they were a slave-owning society. The South was a slave-owning society. And the fact that all the new land that the Cherokee owned generally wasn't permissible to cotton. So the South didn't want it. So there was a good chance that they weren't going to be forced off that land that they now had. So, in retrospect, the federal government of the United States was lackluster in its attempts to ease Cherokee integration into society, so much that it disabused them from the notion of gaining citizenship through the northern method, and they should establish themselves more as of the southern class and gain acceptance in that manner. So they became planters, and they became slave owners, and they grew cotton, and they grew tobacco and indigo and all these other cash crops.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because during my research, I found a quote from one of the Cherokee Nation's declaration of causes for joining alongside the Confederacy, where they said, quote,
Oh, really?
yeah, they said, quote, the war now raging in a war of northern cupidity and fanaticism against the institution of African servitude, against the commercial freedom of the South, and against the political freedom of the states. So here we are, they're viewing themselves as a separate entity capable of fighting off what they view as an enemy coming against their sovereignty, basically.
True. It's definitely something that much consideration needs to be going to, and there's not a lot of historical study, into this.
So going back to what you were saying earlier, you mentioned the Trail of Tears. Can you elaborate on that?
The Trail of Tears was technically the removal of the 5 civilized tribes, of which the Cherokee were a part of. These were the tribes that settlers considered the most civilized, the most assimilated of the Native Americans. What it was that in 1830, the Indian Removal Act passed Congress, by 1 vote, mind you, forcing Native Americans to move east across the Mississippi to frontier lands so that white settlers could have access to the land that they were currently living on. This was spearheaded by, Jackson, but due to the court system at the time, it was actually considered illegal. Worcester v. Georgia in 1832 declared that The treaties between Indian nations and the United States of America was that between nations, so that states had no right to impugn upon or force upon Indian nations any kind of law or contract. What this meant was that earlier in 1828, the Georgia legislature had made a law saying that the Cherokee's nation government was to be dissolved. What the court was saying was that this was illegal, as the state had no right to impugn upon a foreign power. It was also saying that Andrew Jackson did not have the right to break the past treaties that America had had with the Cherokee, which they had stated they would allow them to live on their land. This divided the Cherokee because some Cherokee were just, I'm like, it's just better to get a good deal now and leave without bloodshed, because they were given financial incentive to leave, because they were going to be reimbursed with land in Oklahoma. They were also going to be financially reimbursed for things they had to leave behind, such as their houses. It was quite a quandary within the Cherokee Nation itself. It, in fact, split the nation in twain on political lines. One party wanted to accept the deal and leave, and the others wanted to stay and keep their land. The Treaty Party, as they came to be known as, illegally signed a treaty on behalf of the entire Cherokee Nation, whereas they didn't have the right, because they approximately only made up 15% of the Cherokee population was in favor of the treaty. So it was very onerous in the fact that the federal government thought it now had an agreement amongst all Cherokee to leave, when in fact they did not. So this is what became the Trail of Tears, is when they were forcibly moved off that land after the 2-year quote-unquote grace period, where they were supposed to leave voluntarily, eclipsed.
And I mean, not also, not counting the numerous casualties sustained during the trip.
Yes, approximately 4,000 Cherokee died on the way to Oklahoma. And it's not even counting how many of the slaves died, too, that were forced to go.
Now, as we're coming to a close here, I was wondering if maybe you could give some insight into how these historical events have affected today, like the Cherokee Nation today, and what steps are our government taking currently to, honor these treaties, or what I'm trying to say is have these past events, how have they affected the current status of the Cherokee Nation today?
That is a hard question to answer in its entirety, due to the fact that there's several dozen treaties on hand about what the United States government and the Cherokee Nation are supposed to do. However, most of these treaties that have already been broken in the past will probably never be enforced. One treaty I do know of that is likely to come to fruition is the 1835 Treaty of New Echota, which gave the Cherokee the right for a non-voting member of Congress to be appointed to Congress by the Cherokee to represent their interests in this legislative branch of the American government. But for the Cherokee and many other native peoples, the fact of the matter is that it is a current and ongoing battle to have the federal government honor the treaties that it has broken in the past. One such fight that's carrying on today is the fight for the recognition and the adherence to the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, where the Dakota and Arapaho tribes agreed with the federal government that the lands in the Black Hills, which you'll remember because of Custard, would be theirs in perpetuity unless 75% of all males amongst the tribes agreed to sell the land, which they did not when the federal government seized the lands when gold was found in the Black Hills. So they continue on their fight to get back their land, which it's highly unlikely will ever be returned to them due to the fact of the people living on the land now. But the U.S. government has offered approximately $1 billion in restitution to the Dakota tribes. However, they have not accepted the money because they continue to state that the land once and forever is not for sale, and they continue to ask for it to be returned to them. So, on the subject of the treaties as they stand, it's some will probably and most likely be honored. Others will be continuously disregarded now as they have in the past, just due to the bureaucratic and selfish nature of the U.S. government.
Well, that is rather interesting. Hopefully, in the coming years, plausibly we could see some further improvements or progress.
Of course, it's always a good thing to see.
Yeah, pertaining to the Cherokee Nation as well as other nations involved throughout the country. Well, this has been enjoyable.
Well, Mr. Marshall, thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
We hope that we can have you here again.
That sounds good to me.
All right, listeners, thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a most wonderful and enjoyous day.